Hello and welcome back to the channel. It's so good to have you here tonight. Whether you're settling in for the evening, lying in bed with the lights dimmed low, or simply seeking a peaceful escape from the noise of the day, you're in exactly the right place. Tonight, we're going on a journey together, a journey back through time to a world that operated by rules so different from our own that they might seem almost unbelievable. We're traveling to ancient Israel, to a time when laws weren't just words on paper, but matters of life and death. When a single mistake gathering sticks on the wrong day, touching the wrong object, even wearing the wrong clothing, could change your fate forever. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in a society where your ox could put you on trial? Where touching a sacred mountain meant instant execution. Where your neighbor could legally take you to court because you didn't build a railing on your roof. These weren't theoretical laws. These were the regulations that governed every single day of life for the ancient Israelites. And here's what makes this so fascinating. Many of these laws seem completely bizarre to us now. Some seem harsh beyond measure. Others seem oddly specific, as if they were written in response to very particular situations. And a few actually seem surprisingly progressive for their time. So tonight, I invite you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Pull your blanket up just the way you like it. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow, deep breath in, and let it out even more slowly. You don't need to stay awake for this entire journey. In fact, this story is designed to carry you gently into sleep whenever you're ready. There's no test at the end, no need to remember every detail. Just let the words wash over you like waves, pulling you deeper and deeper into relaxation with each passing moment. We're going to explore the strangest laws of ancient Israel together. We'll walk through the city gates where justice was administered. We'll stand in the fields where farmers had to follow specific agricultural rules. We'll witness punishments that seem shocking and discover laws that protected the vulnerable in ways that might surprise you. And after we've explored these ancient regulations, I have 3 shorter stories to share with you. Real accounts from the biblical text of what happened when these laws were broken or challenged. Stories of unexpected executions, corporate punishment, and even a moment when 5 brave women stood up to change the law itself. So let your eyelids grow heavy if they want to. Let your breathing slow to its natural rhythm. And let's step back in time together to a world where the law touched every aspect of life, from the profound to the peculiar. Let's begin. Imagine living in a world where certain crimes didn't lead to prison time or fines, but to immediate public execution. Not by a faceless state, but by your own community, your neighbors, sometimes even members of your own family. In ancient Israel, the death penalty wasn't rare. It wasn't reserved only for the worst of the worst. It was prescribed for a surprisingly long list of offenses, and the method of execution was almost always the same: stoning. Picture a person standing in an open space, perhaps just outside the city gates. The ground beneath their feet is hard-packed earth, dusty and uneven. Around them a crowd has gathered, not strangers, but people they've known their entire lives. The baker who sold them bread, the woman who drew water from the same well, children they watched grow up, the witnesses, and there had to be at least 2, always 2, would cast the first stones. This wasn't symbolic. These were rocks heavy enough to cause real harm, pulled from the ground or gathered from the surrounding hills. The sound of that first impact, the awful, heavy thud of stone against flesh. It was a sound that marked a point of no return. But let's step back. What crimes warranted this ultimate punishment? Murder, of course. That seems almost universal, doesn't it? If you intentionally took another person's life, your own life was forfeit. The principle was clear. Life for life. But here's what's interesting, ancient. Israel made a distinction that many ancient cultures didn't. They understood the difference between intentional murder and accidental killing. If you were working in the forest, swinging an axe to cut wood, and the head flew off and struck someone, killing them, that wasn't murder. You weren't executed. Instead, you could flee to one of the cities of refuge special towns set aside throughout the land where you'd be protected from the victim's family, who had the legal right to avenge their relative's blood. Think about that for a moment. Cities of refuge. 6 of them strategically placed so that no one in Israel was more than 30 miles from safety. The roads leading to these cities were kept in perfect repair. All obstacles were removed. Bridges were built over rivers. Signs were posted at every intersection with one word, refuge. Because if the avenger of blood caught you before you reached that city, well, they could kill you on the spot, and it was completely legal. But intentional murder, that was different. There was no refuge for that. No amount of money could pay for a life deliberately taken. The community had to act. Justice had to be seen, felt, completed. And it wasn't just murder. Striking your father or mother was a capital offense. Not just beating them severely, the text says striking them at all. Imagine that. A moment of rage, a hand raised against a parent, and suddenly you're facing the stones. Kidnapping someone and selling them into slavery? Death? Cursing your parents? Death. Being a rebellious son, and we'll come back to what that actually meant, could result in execution. Adultery, when proven by those 2 required witnesses, meant death for both parties involved. Certain forms of sexual immorality, including bestiality and homosexual acts, carried the death penalty. Blasphemy speaking against God in specific, intentional ways was capital. Working on the Sabbath could be, in certain circumstances, a fatal decision. Witchcraft, sorcery, consulting with mediums or spirits of the dead, all carried the ultimate sentence. Now, here's something crucial to understand. This seems like a long list, doesn't it? It seems harsh, maybe even brutal. But there were significant protections built into the system that meant execution was actually quite rare. First, those 2 witnesses. They had to see the crime with their own eyes. They had to warn the person beforehand that what they were about to do was forbidden and carried the death penalty. They had to see the person acknowledge the warning and proceed anyway. And their testimonies had to align perfectly, down to the smallest details. If there were any discrepancies, any contradictions at all, the case was thrown out. And here's the part that might surprise you most. If the judges found someone guilty based on witness testimony, and it was later discovered that the witnesses had lied, those witnesses received the exact punishment they had sought to inflict. They testified to a capital crime falsely. They were executed instead. This made people very, very careful about bearing witness. The execution itself followed a specific procedure. The witnesses cast the first stones, taking responsibility for their testimony in the most direct way possible. Then the community joined in. It was never the work of one person. The guilt, and it was considered guilt even when justice was being served, was shared among many hands. Other methods of execution were mentioned for specific crimes, though stoning remained the most common. Burning was prescribed for certain sexual offenses. Hanging was sometimes mentioned. Though this typically occurred after death by another means, the body would be hung as a public statement, then taken down before nightfall, because leaving a body hanging overnight defiled the land. The sword was used in some cases, usually in situations of war or immediate judgment rather than judicial proceedings. And then there was the principle that people often quote but rarely understand: eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. This sounds brutal, doesn't it? Like a mandate for escalating violence, for vengeance matching the injury. But actually it was the opposite. It was a limitation on punishment, not a requirement for it. It meant you couldn't take someone's life for injuring your eye. You couldn't kill someone's son because they killed your ox. The punishment had to fit the crime, nothing more. In practice, this often meant monetary compensation rather than literal physical retribution. If you injured someone's eye, you paid a fine equivalent to the damage done. The principle was proportionality, not vengeance. Let your breathing slow as you imagine this world, a world where justice was public, immediate, and irreversible, where the community bore the weight of punishment together, where two witnesses in careful testimony stood between life and death. We're going to continue our journey through these ancient laws, but let yourself sink deeper into comfort. Let your muscles relax. There's so much more to discover, and the night is long and peaceful. Now, let's talk about something that probably occupied the minds of ancient Israelites far more often than capital crimes, property disputes, and theft. Because here's the thing, most people went their entire lives without witnessing an execution. But livestock wandering into the wrong field? That happened all the time. Someone's ox goring a neighbor? Not uncommon. Theft of grain or tools or clothing? That was a real recurring concern in daily life, and the laws around property were specific, surprisingly specific. Let's say you stole a sheep from your neighbor's flock. You're caught, and the case goes before the elders at the city gate. What happens to you? You're not imprisoned. Ancient Israel didn't really have prisons the way we think of them. There were places to hold someone temporarily while their case was being decided, but long-term incarceration wasn't part of the justice system. Instead, you had to pay restitution, and not just replacing what you stole, you had to pay back more. For stealing a sheep, you paid back 4 sheep. For stealing an ox, which was worth much more because it could work the fields, you paid back 5 oxen. But here's where it gets interesting. If you still had the stolen animal, if you'd taken it but not killed it or sold it yet, you only had to pay back double. The additional penalty came from what you'd deprived the owner of in the meantime. The sheep that wasn't there to produce wool or lambs, the ox that wasn't there to plow the field. And if you couldn't pay, then you were sold into indentured servitude until the debt was worked off. Your labor became the restitution. Now imagine this scenario. It's the middle of the night. You're asleep in your home, which might be a single room with your whole family, the cool night air coming through the small windows, the sound of your animals in the adjacent space or just outside. You hear something, a sound that doesn't belong. Someone is breaking through your wall, remember? Many homes had walls made of dried mud brick. relatively easy to dig through with determination and a tool. A thief in the darkness breaking into your home. Under these circumstances, if you struck the thief and they died, you were not guilty of murder. The darkness meant you couldn't assess the threat. You didn't know if they were armed, what they intended, whether your family was in danger. Your action was considered self-defense. But, and this is fascinating, if the sun had risen, if it was daylight and you killed the thief, then you were guilty of bloodshed. Because in daylight you could see the threat level. You could identify the person, you could call for help. The immediate, lethal response was no longer justified. Think about what that means for a moment. The law recognized circumstances. It understood that the same action defending your property had different moral weight depending on the context. Let's consider another situation. You need an ox for plowing, but you don't own one, so you borrow your neighbor's ox. This was common communities, shared resources, and there were established customs and laws around borrowing. But while the ox is in your care, it dies. Just dies natural causes, maybe a snake bite, maybe an illness that came on suddenly. What happens now? If you borrowed the ox without the owner present, you had to make restitution. You had to replace the ox or pay its value. But if the owner was present, working alongside you, then the loss was his. The reasoning? He was there to supervise, to make decisions about the animal's care. He bore part of the responsibility. And if you'd hired the ox paid a rental fee for its use, the loss was also the owner's. The rental fee covered the risk. These laws created a framework of responsibility and risk-sharing that kept the community functioning. Here's another one. You're walking along a path, and you find someone's donkey or ox that has wandered off. Maybe you recognize it as your neighbor's. Maybe you don't know whose it is. You couldn't just leave it there. The law required you to take care of it, to bring it back to its owner or keep it safe until the owner was found. And if you saw your enemy's donkey collapsed under its burden, you had to help. Not optional, required. Even if you despised the person, even if there was bad blood between you, you had to stop and assist with their animal. These weren't just property laws. They were community laws designed to maintain relationships, to prevent feuds from escalating, to ensure that everyone looked out for everyone else's welfare. The marketplace had laws too. Your weights and measures had to be honest. You couldn't have one set of stones for buying heavier ones, so you paid less, and another for selling lighter ones, so you received more. This was called an abomination, the same word used for the most serious moral offenses. Think about being a merchant in an ancient Israelite town. Your stones for weighing grain, your measuring vessels for oil and wine, they could be inspected at any time. If you were found cheating, your reputation was destroyed. In a small community where everyone knew everyone, where trade depended on trust, this was devastating. If you dug a pit and didn't cover it, and someone's animal fell in and died, you paid for the animal. If your ox was known to be aggressive, and you didn't keep it properly secured, and it killed someone, we're back to capital crimes. You could be put to death for negligence. Your property rights were protected, yes, but they came with responsibilities. The law assumed that you would be careful, honest, and community-minded. And when you weren't, when negligence or dishonesty or theft occurred, the consequences were designed to restore balance, to make the victim whole, and to maintain the social fabric. As you listen to these laws, notice how your breathing has slowed. how your body has settled more deeply into rest. The ancient world had its own logic, its own way of maintaining order, and there's something almost soothing about the clarity of it, the directness of cause and consequence. Let yourself drift as we continue. Let these ancient rules wash over you like a lullaby from a distant time. Now we enter into the laws that govern the most intimate aspects of life: marriage, family, sexuality, and reproduction. These are the laws that shaped who you could love, who you could marry, and what happened when those boundaries were crossed. Take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. This is complex territory, and we're going to walk through it with care and historical understanding. In ancient Israel, marriage wasn't primarily about romance, though love certainly existed. It was about family alliance, about property, about continuing the family name and bloodline. When a young woman married, her father received a bride price, a mohur, from the groom or the groom's family. This wasn't buying a wife in the way we might think of it. It was compensation to the bride's family for the loss of her labor, and it served as a security deposit of sorts. If the marriage ended badly through the husband's fault, that bride price protected the woman financially. But let's talk about what happened when the carefully regulated boundaries around sexuality were violated. Adultery sexual relations between a married woman and any man not her husband was a capital offense for both parties. Notice the specificity there. A married woman. If a married man had relations with an unmarried woman, that was handled differently. The law was primarily concerned with paternity, with knowing whose children were whose, with maintaining clear family lines. If the adultery was proven, remember those two witnesses actually seeing the act. Both the man and the woman were executed, usually by stoning outside the city, with the community participating. But here's something that's often overlooked. Those requirements for witnesses and proof made conviction quite rare. You needed two people who witnessed the sexual act itself, who warned the couple beforehand, who saw them proceed anyway. This wasn't easy to prove. Now, what if a man suspected his wife of adultery but had no proof? No witnesses, just suspicion, jealousy, that gnawing uncertainty? There was a ritual for that. It's described in detail in the book of Numbers, and it's one of the strangest procedures in all of ancient law. The husband would bring his wife to the priest at the tabernacle, later the temple. The priest would prepare what's called the bitter water. He would take holy water in a clay jar, mix in dust from the tabernacle floor, and write the curses associated with adultery on a scroll. Then he'd wash the writing off the scroll into the water. The woman would stand before the Lord, her hair unbound, a sign of being in a vulnerable, liminal state. She would drink the bitter water, and then she waited. According to the ritual, if she was guilty, the water would cause her body to waste away, her abdomen to swell, her thigh to rot. If she was innocent, nothing would happen, and she would be able to conceive children. Let that image settle in your mind. The temple, the incense smoke, the priest's solemn voice, the bitter taste of that water, and the fear, whether guilty or innocent, of what might happen next. This ritual served a purpose beyond determining guilt. It removed the matter from the husband's hands, placed it before God, and prevented blood feuds or private vengeance based on suspicion alone. Let's talk about other sexual regulations. If a man seduced a virgin who wasn't engaged, he had to pay her bride price and marry her, unless her father absolutely refused, in which case he still paid the bride price, but she didn't have to marry him. This protected the woman whose prospects for marriage would have been severely damaged by the loss of her virginity. But if a man raped an engaged woman, it was treated as seriously as murder. The woman was considered a victim. The text specifically says she cried out. She resisted. The man was executed. If he raped an unengaged virgin, he had to marry her and could never divorce her. He paid 50 shekels of silver to her father, a significant sum, and she was bound to him for life, with the financial security that provided, but without the option to leave. We can look at this and see how different it is from our modern understanding of justice for sexual violence. But in a world where a woman's economic security came through family or husband, where loss of virginity could mean perpetual poverty and social isolation, these laws provided a form of protection, however imperfect it seems to us now. Now, here's a law that seems particularly strange: levirate marriage. Imagine this. Your husband dies. You have no children, no sons to carry on his name or inherit his property. Under normal circumstances, you might return to your father's household, but you're in a vulnerable position. But your deceased husband has a brother. That brother is now required by law to marry you. Not optional, required. The first son you have together is legally considered the son of your dead husband, carrying on his name and inheriting his portion of the family property. This is levirate marriage, and it served multiple purposes. It provided for the widow, it preserved the dead man's name and inheritance, and it kept property within the family clan. But what if the brother refused? Then there was a public ceremony. The widow would approach him in front of the elders at the city gate. She would remove his sandal, a symbolic act related to property rights and transactions, and spit in his face. Actually spit in his face right there in public. And forever after, his family line would be known as the house of him whose sandal was removed, a mark of shame that would follow his descendants. There were, of course, forbidden relationships. You couldn't marry your mother, your stepmother, your sister, your half-sister, your granddaughter, your aunt, your daughter-in-law, your sister-in-law while your brother was alive, or a woman and her daughter or granddaughter. These incest prohibitions created clear boundaries around family relationships. Homosexual acts were forbidden and carried severe penalties. This is stated explicitly in the law codes. Bestiality was a capital crime for both the human and the animal involved. Cross-dressing men wearing women's clothing or vice versa was forbidden, called an abomination. The reasoning isn't entirely clear to us now, but it likely related to maintaining distinct gender roles and possibly to avoiding practices associated with pagan worship. Divorce was permitted, but it required a formal certificate. A man couldn't just send his wife away. He had to provide written documentation, which gave her legal status and allowed her to remarry. The certificate said, essentially, this woman is no longer my wife. She is free to marry another man. The grounds for divorce were debated even in ancient times. The text says if a man finds something indecent in his wife, he can divorce her. But what did that mean? Some rabbis said it meant adultery. Others said it could be something as trivial as burning his dinner. The debate continued for centuries. What's clear is that the certificate provided protection. It prevented a man from claiming later that the woman was still his wife. It gave her legal standing. In a world where women's security depended on their marital status, this mattered enormously. Let your eyes grow heavy as you consider these ancient structures. the laws that govern the most personal parts of life, the ways that community, family, and individual need intersected and sometimes conflicted. We're going to move now into different territory, into the laws that govern farming, food, and the rhythm of agricultural life. But first, let yourself sink a little deeper into comfort. Feel the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. Notice how your breath has found its own slow, steady rhythm. The ancient world is speaking to us still, across thousands of years. Let's step out into the fields now. Feel the sun on your shoulders, the soil beneath your feet, the sound of wind moving through growing grain. This is where most ancient Israelites spent most of their time working the land, tending flocks, trying to coax enough food from the earth to feed their families for another year. And even here, especially here, the law had something to say. Every 7th year, the land was to rest. No planting, no harvesting of what grew on its own, no cultivation. This was the Sabbath year, the Shmita. Whatever grew without planting volunteers from last year's crop could be eaten by anyone. Your family, your servants, strangers passing through, even the wild animals. The land belonged to everyone and no one during that year. Imagine the faith that required. In an agricultural society where one bad harvest could mean starvation, you were commanded to let the fields lie fallow for an entire year every 7 years. To trust that the previous year's harvest would be enough, that God would provide, that the community would share resources. And then every 50th year after 7 cycles of 7 years came the Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, all land returned to its original family ownership. If you'd sold your ancestral land because of debt, because of hard times, because you needed quick money, it came back. The slate was wiped clean. Family inheritances were restored. This meant that land sales weren't really permanent sales. When you sold land, you were really selling the number of harvests until the next Jubilee. If Jubilee was 5 years away, the price was low. If it was 40 years away, the price was higher. You were pricing the productive use of the land, not the land itself, which would always return to the original family. Think about what this prevented. The endless accumulation of wealth by a few families, the creation of a permanent underclass who lost their land and had to work for others forever. Every 50 years there was an economic reset. Now, when you did harvest, you couldn't take everything. When you reaped your grain, you couldn't harvest the corners of the field. You had to leave them standing. When you went through picking up the sheaves you'd cut, you couldn't go back for the ones you missed. When you beat your olive trees to get the olives, you couldn't go over the branches a second time to get every last one. Why? These were for the poor, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner living among you. They had the legal right to come into your field and gather what you'd left behind. This was called gleaning. Picture a widow, her children beside her, moving through a barley field after the harvest, gathering the stalks left in the corners, picking up the dropped sheaves. This was how the vulnerable survived. Not charity exactly, but a legal right to access food. There's a whole biblical book, Ruth, about a foreign widow who survives by gleaning in the fields and eventually catches the attention of the field's owner. The system provided for her, and the story shows both how it worked and how it could lead to restoration and new family connections. Even your working animals had rights. Do not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. The ox working to separate grain from chaff, walking in circles over the harvest, had the right to eat while it worked. You couldn't prevent it from taking mouthfuls of the grain it was processing. This simple law reveals something about the ethical framework. Even animal needs and basic fairness mattered. Now, let's talk about the food laws, the regulations about what you could and couldn't eat. Animals were divided into clean and unclean. To be clean, a land animal had to have a split hoof and chew its cud. Cows, sheep, goats, deer clean. Pigs, camels, rabbits unclean. Fish had to have fins and scales. Most common fish clean. Shellfish, eels, catfish unclean. Birds were listed more specifically. Most were clean, but scavengers and birds of prey, eagles, vultures, ravens, were unclean. Insects were mostly unclean, except for certain types of locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers, which were edible. The reasons behind these classifications have been debated for millennia. Some scholars point to health concerns, pigs in that climate, shellfish without refrigeration, scavengers that eat carrion. Others note that the unclean animals often had associations with pagan worship or death. Still others see the distinctions as creating a sense of holiness through separation, through making conscious choices about even the most basic acts of daily life. Whatever the original reasoning, the effect was clear. Every time you ate, you were reminded of your identity, your covenant, your difference from surrounding nations. And then there's one of the most puzzling laws. Do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. This appears 3 times in the law, which suggests it was important. But why? We're not entirely sure. Some scholars think it was a Canaanite fertility ritual being forbidden. Others see it as a compassion issue. Don't use the very substance meant to nurture life to cook death. Whatever the original meaning, this law became the basis for the entire system of keeping meat and dairy separate in traditional Jewish practice. Separate dishes, separate cooking utensils, waiting hours between eating meat and dairy, all from this one enigmatic commandment. You also couldn't plant 2 kinds of seed in the same field. You couldn't plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. Animals of different strength and stride would struggle unequally. You couldn't wear clothing made of mixed fibers, wool and linen woven together was forbidden. These mixture laws created categories and boundaries. They took the concept of holiness, which means set apart, and made it tangible in daily choices. Let your imagination rest now in an ancient field. Smell the cut grain, feel the chaff in the air, hear the sound of wheat being separated from stalk. The rhythm of agricultural life, the turn of seasons, the laws that govern when to plant, when to rest, what to eat, how to share. Your breathing is slow and steady, like the patient growth of crops, like the reliable cycle of harvest and fallow. We're going to continue exploring these ancient regulations, but let yourself drift if you need to. Let the words carry you like wind over grain fields. Let's talk about daily life beyond the fishing itself, because when you weren't on the boat or processing the catch, you still had a life to live, a home, a family, routines, and all of it was simpler, harder, and more exhausting than anything most of us can imagine today. Your house, it was small, really small, maybe 300 square feet total if you were doing well. Maybe less if you weren't. It was made of stone or mud brick, thick walls to keep out the heat in summer and the cold in winter. A flat roof made of wooden beams covered with branches and packed clay. You could walk on the roof. In fact, you used it as extra living space, a place to sleep on hot nights, a place to dry food, a place to sit in the evening when the house felt too cramped. There were openings, not really windows, more like small holes in the walls for ventilation. Maybe one door, low and narrow, with a wooden frame and a curtain or simple door. Inside there were 2 or 3 rooms. Maybe a main room where everyone ate and worked during the day. Maybe a smaller room where you slept at night. Maybe a storage area for jars of grain and oil and dried fish. The floor was packed earth. Hard, uneven, dusty in summer, muddy in winter. Some wealthier families had stone floors, but probably not yours. Furniture was minimal. Not because you preferred minimalism, but because furniture was expensive and took up space. You had sleeping mats woven reed or wool, rolled up during the day and spread out at night. You had low tables, just wooden planks on short legs. You had some storage jars, large clay vessels for water, grain, oil, wine, maybe a few bowls and cups. A lamp or 2 small clay oil lamps that gave off a flickering, smoky light. That was about it. No chairs, no couches. You sat on the floor or on your rolled-up sleeping mats. You ate sitting cross-legged on the ground. And you shared this space with everyone. Your wife, your children, maybe your parents if they were still alive. Maybe a widowed sister or an unmarried brother. 3 generations under one small roof was completely normal. Privacy didn't exist. Not really. You couldn't go to your room and close the door. There weren't separate bedrooms. Everyone slept in the same space, or maybe the parents had one small room and the children slept in another. You heard everything. Every conversation, every argument, every illness, every snore. You were never alone. At night you spread out the sleeping mats. Everyone claimed their spot. The mats were thin, not much padding between you and the hard ground. If you were wealthy, maybe you had a stuffed cushion or a wool blanket. But most people just had a cloak to pull over themselves when it got cold. You slept in your tunic. You didn't have pajamas. You just lay down in whatever you'd been wearing all day, pulled your cloak over you, and tried to sleep despite the discomfort and the noise and the fleas. Yes, fleas. And probably lice too. Infestations were common. You couldn't really get rid of them. You just lived with them, scratching, constantly scratching. Sleep came quickly, though, because you were exhausted. You'd been up since before dawn. You'd worked all night. Your body demanded rest. So despite the hard floor and the itching and the snoring family members around you, you fell asleep within minutes. And then, a few hours later, you woke up and did it all again. Food. Let's talk about food. Because your diet was repetitive, limited, mostly the same things over and over. Bread was the foundation of every meal. Barley bread usually, not wheat. Wheat was more expensive. Barley was the grain of the poor and working class. Your wife or daughters ground the grain by hand every day, kneeling over a stone grinder, pushing the upper stone in circles over the lower stone, crushing the kernels into flour. It took hours. Their shoulders and backs ached from it constantly. Then they mixed the flour with water and a bit of salt, kneaded it, shaped it into flat rounds, baked it on a hot stone or in a small clay oven. The bread was flat, dense, chewy, not particularly delicious, but filling. You ate bread at every meal, morning, midday, evening. Always bread. With the bread, you might have olive oil to dip it in. Olives were plentiful in Galilee. Every family had access to olive oil. It was your primary source of fat. You used it for cooking, for lamps, for medicine, for everything. You might have some vegetables. Lentils were common boiled into a thick stew. Beans, onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, whatever was in season and affordable. You might have some fruit. Figs, dates, pomegranates, grapes. Again, whatever was in season. These were treats. You didn't eat them every day. And you had fish, obviously. More fish than most people because you caught your own grilled fish, salted fish, dried fish, fish stew, fish with bread, fish with lentils. Fish, fish, fish. What you didn't have much of was meat. Beef, lamb, goat, those were expensive. You only ate meat on special occasions. Sabbath meals if you were doing well. Religious festivals, weddings. That was about it. Most of your meals were bread, oil, vegetables, and fish. The same things every day, with minor variations depending on the season. You didn't eat to enjoy food. You ate to survive, to have energy for the work. Meals were functional, not pleasurable, and the portions were small. You didn't have excess. You ate enough to keep going, but you were probably hungry a lot. That constant low-level hunger that never quite went away. Your stomach never felt completely full. This is what Jesus meant when he taught his disciples to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." It wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. You needed bread today. You needed it tomorrow. You needed it every day. And you weren't sure you'd always have it. Water. You got water from the lake, from wells, from cisterns that collected rainwater. It wasn't always clean. You boiled it sometimes if you were concerned, but mostly you just drank it and hoped you didn't get sick. Sickness happened, though. Stomach illnesses from contaminated water. Skin infections from the constant moisture and lack of hygiene. Respiratory problems from the smoky indoor air. Those oil lamps and cooking fires filled the house with smoke, and there wasn't much ventilation. Eye infections were common. The glare from the sun reflecting off the water, the dust in the air, the lack of proper washing, all of this led to chronic eye problems. Many people went partially blind as they aged. Dental problems. No toothbrushes, no dentists. Your teeth wore down from the gritty breadstone grinders, left tiny particles of stone in the flour. Cavities developed. Teeth fell out. By the time you were 40, you were probably missing several teeth. Life expectancy was short. If you survived childhood, and many didn't, you might live to your 50s or 60s if you were lucky. But many men died younger. Accidents on the water, storms, disease, the hard labor wore your body down. Bathing was infrequent. There was the ritual washing at the mikveh for religious purity, but daily bathing wasn't really a thing. You didn't have running water. Heating water took time and fuel, so you washed your hands and face regularly, maybe your feet. But a full bath? That was rare, which meant you smelled. Everyone smelled. Body odor was just part of life. You didn't really notice it on yourself or your family because you were used to it. But add in the fish smell, the smoke smell, the sweat from physical labor, and, yeah, you were pretty ripe most of the time. Your clothes. You owned maybe 2 tunics. Maybe 3 if you were wealthy. One for working, one for Sabbath. The tunics were simple, basically a large rectangular piece of wool or linen, folded and sewn up the sides, with holes for your head and arms. You wore a belt around your waist to keep it from dragging on the ground. Over the tunic you wore a cloak, a larger rectangular piece of fabric that could be wrapped around you in various ways. It was your coat in winter, your blanket when you slept, your prayer shawl in the synagogue. It was multi-purpose. You wore sandals, leather straps over a leather sole, simple, practical. They wore out regularly, and you repaired them or replaced them when you had to. And that was your entire wardrobe. 2 tunics, a cloak, sandals, maybe a head covering a cloth to protect from sun and keep sweat out of your eyes. You washed your clothes occasionally, beating them against rocks in the lake, letting the sun dry them. But they were never really clean. They were stained, worn, patched. You wore them until they literally fell apart, and then you patched them again. This was life. This was normal. Everyone lived this way. Everyone except the very wealthy, and there weren't many of those in fishing villages. You accepted it. You didn't know any different. This was just how people lived, how your parents lived, how their parents lived, how your children would live. Simple, hard, repetitive, exhausting, but also in some ways stable, predictable. You knew what each day would bring. You knew your role, your place, your community. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Sabbath every 7 days, a day of rest, of worship, of family. Festivals throughout the year marking the seasons and the harvest and the holy days. Your life was narrow, but it was full. Full of family, full of work, full of community. You weren't alone in your struggles. Everyone around you was struggling in the same ways, and in that shared struggle there was connection. There was meaning. There was the satisfaction of providing for your family, of pulling your weight, of being part of something larger than yourself. It wasn't a good life by modern standards, but it was your life, and you lived it the best you could, until someone came along and offered something different, something more, something beyond the endless cycle of work and exhaustion and just barely getting by. And when that offer came, well, we'll get to that. But first, let's look at the moment when everything changed for those first fishermen. Let's see what happened when Jesus called. Imagine you have a dispute with your neighbor. He claims your fence crosses onto his land. Or you borrowed his cloak and he says you never returned it. Or someone accuses you of cheating them in a business deal. Where do you go? What does justice look like in ancient Israel? You go to the city gate. Not a courthouse, not a government building. The gate, the wide entrance to the city, with its large open area, its built-in benches along the walls, its constant flow of people coming and going. This is where the elders sit, the respected older men of the community, the ones who've proven their wisdom and judgment over years of life. They gather here regularly, available to hear cases, to settle disputes, to render judgment. The gate is public. Anyone can observe. Justice happens in the open, in full view of the community. You present your case. You bring your witnesses. Your neighbor presents his case and brings his witnesses. The elders ask questions, examine the testimony, consider the evidence. There are rules, strict rules about testimony and proof. First, one witness is never enough. Never. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. One person's word against another, the case is dismissed. The judges can't act on uncorroborated testimony. This protected people from false accusations. Your enemy couldn't destroy you with a lie if he couldn't find someone to lie with him. And remember, lying witnesses faced severe consequences. The witnesses had to have first-hand knowledge. They had to see the event with their own eyes, or in some cases hear it with their own ears. Hearsay didn't count. I heard that he wasn't testimony. I saw him was. The judges examined witnesses carefully, separately, looking for consistency in their accounts. What time of day was it? What was the weather? Who else was present? Where exactly did this happen? The testimonies had to align on all significant details. If there were contradictions, if the stories didn't match, the case could be thrown out. And if it was discovered that the witnesses had conspired to lie, if their stories were too perfectly matched in a way that suggested coordination rather than genuine memory, that raised suspicions too. Here's what happened to false witnesses. You must do to the false witness as that witness intended to do to the other party. Think about that. If someone testified falsely that you committed murder, intending to get you executed, and their lie was discovered, they were executed instead. If they testified you stole, intending to make you pay restitution, and their lie was exposed, they paid the restitution they'd tried to impose on you. This made people very, very careful about bearing witness. The risk was too high. You were literally putting your own life or livelihood on the line when you testified against someone. And here's another crucial protection. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Judges couldn't take payment for favorable judgments. The penalty for accepting bribes was severe, and the community was warned repeatedly about the corrupting power of money in the justice system. Justice was supposed to be impartial. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Not even sympathy for poverty could twist judgment. The case had to be decided on its merits, on the facts, on the testimony. But there was also this. Do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. The vulnerable needed protection from those who might use their wealth or power to oppress them. Justice required special attention to ensure the weak weren't trampled. Foreigners living among the Israelites had legal rights. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native-born. Love them as yourself. In legal disputes, aliens had standing. They could bring cases. They could testify. They couldn't be dismissed or oppressed simply because they weren't native-born. This was radical for the ancient world. Most societies had different laws for citizens and foreigners, with foreigners having minimal rights. But Israel's law insisted on equal justice. For particularly difficult cases, ones the local elders couldn't resolve, there was a higher court. You could appeal to the priests and judges at the central sanctuary, the tabernacle, later the temple in Jerusalem. Their decision was final. Act according to whatever they teach you and the decisions they give you. Do not turn aside from what they tell you to the right or to the left. If you deliberately defied their ruling, if you arrogantly rejected the verdict of the highest court, you could be executed. You must purge the evil from Israel. The functioning of the justice system itself had to be protected. There was also a category of cases that couldn't be decided by human judges at all. When evidence was insufficient, when there were no witnesses, when the truth was hidden, sometimes the matter was left to God. A person might swear an oath before the Lord, calling on God to witness the truth of their claim. Breaking such an oath was incredibly serious. You were inviting divine judgment on yourself. Or the parties might agree to a trial by ordeal like the bitter water test for suspected adultery we discussed earlier. The outcome was believed to reveal divine judgment. Now let's talk about the kinsman redeemer, the Goel. This was a relative, usually the closest male relative, who had both rights and responsibilities regarding your welfare. If you were forced to sell your land because of poverty, your kinsman redeemer had the right and responsibility to buy it back, keeping it in the family. If you were sold into slavery to pay debts, he was supposed to redeem you, buying your freedom. If you were murdered, your kinsman redeemer was the avenger of blood, the one legally entitled to pursue the killer and exact justice. This created a system of mutual responsibility. Families were accountable for each other. You weren't alone in facing hardship or injustice. Your relatives had legal obligations to help you. Picture the city gate again. The elders sitting on the stone benches, the smooth surfaces worn by countless sitters over the years, the dust hanging in the air, people conducting business, coming and going through the entrance. And there, in the middle, a case being heard. 2 merchants in dispute, witnesses being called forward, questions being asked, the deliberation, the quiet conversation among the elders. Then a verdict announced publicly so everyone can hear. Justice, ancient style. Communal, public, personal. The judges knew the people involved. They understood the context. They would see these people again tomorrow, next week, next year. Their reputations depended on judging fairly. Your eyes are so heavy now. The ancient gate, the voices of testimony, the weight of judgment, it all fades into a distant murmur. Let yourself rest as we move into our final chapter of Ancient Laws, the strangest regulations of all. Now we come to the laws that make even biblical scholars pause and wonder, what was the situation that prompted this? Why was this necessary? What world did these people live in where this specific regulation was needed? Take a deep, slow breath. Let it out. We're entering the realm of the truly peculiar. Let's start with clothing. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. Cross-dressing was forbidden, not just discouraged, called an abomination, a detestable thing. In a world where clothing differences between men and women might have been less dramatic than in some later periods, this law drew a firm line. Gender distinctions in dress were to be maintained. Some scholars think this related to pagan worship practices where ritual cross-dressing occurred. Others see it as maintaining clear social categories. Whatever the reason, the prohibition was absolute. Now, here's one that probably saved lives. When you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof. Ancient Israelite houses had flat roofs. They were used as living space, a place to sleep on hot nights, to dry fruit, to have conversations in the evening breeze. People spent time up there, and the roofs were accessed by outside stairs. Without a railing, a parapet, someone could easily fall off. A child playing. A person walking too close to the edge at night. A guest unfamiliar with the layout. If you didn't build a protective barrier and someone fell and died, you were legally responsible for their death. The guilt of bloodshed was on you. This law assumed you would think ahead, take responsibility for creating safe spaces, consider the vulnerability of others who might use your property. Your home wasn't just your private space, it was part of the community fabric, and you had obligations to protect anyone who might enter it. Here's a law about animals. Do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. Why? They're different sizes, different strengths, different gaits. Yoking them together would mean unequal strain, one animal bearing more weight than the other, neither able to work efficiently. It was both impractical and cruel. The law extended this principle. Do not plant two kinds of seed in your field. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. These mixture prohibitions have puzzled interpreters for centuries. Were they about maintaining categories, about preserving distinctions? Were they remnants of earlier taboos? Did they relate to pagan practices being avoided? We don't know for certain, but the effect was to make daily life farming, getting dressed, an act of obedience, a conscious choice to follow covenant regulations. Now, here's a law that shows surprising compassion. If you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. You may take the young, but be sure to let the mother go, so that it may go well with you, and you may have a long life. You could take the eggs or the chicks for food. That was fine, but you had to let the mother bird go. Don't wipe out the future reproductive capacity. Don't take everything. Leave the source of future life. This principle of sustainable use, of thinking beyond immediate need, appears in multiple laws. It's why you couldn't harvest every corner of your field, why you had to leave some for the poor and for future growth. Let's talk about the rebellious son. This is one of the most disturbing laws in the entire Torah. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a profligate and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town are to stone him to death." A son who persistently defied his parents, who was a glutton and drunkard, which probably meant someone who squandered family resources and brought shame on the household, could be executed by the community at the parents' request. This seems almost unthinkable to us. A parent bringing their own child to be stoned to death? But here's what's interesting. There's no record in all of Scripture or later Jewish tradition of this law ever being applied. Not once. Some rabbis suggested it never happened because the conditions were so specific both parents had to agree. The son had to be of a specific age range. He had to meet all the criteria exactly, that it was more of a theoretical deterrent than a practical reality. Still, the fact that it was written down, that it was part of the law code, tells us something about how seriously parental authority and family honor were regarded. Here's another one. If a woman tried to help her husband in a fight by grabbing his opponent's genitals, her hand was to be cut off. Show her no pity. This is the only instance in biblical law where physical mutilation is prescribed as punishment. Everywhere else, even in the eye for eye, tooth for tooth passages, the principle was usually satisfied with monetary compensation. But this actual cutting off of a hand, why so severe? Perhaps because the action could damage the man's ability to father children, threatening his family line. Perhaps because it violated taboos about touching another man's sexual organs. perhaps because it showed a particularly shameful form of violence. We don't know, but the severity stands out precisely because it's so unusual. Let's talk about the beautiful captive. When Israelite soldiers went to war and captured a beautiful woman, they couldn't simply rape her or force her into slavery. There was a procedure. The soldier could bring her home, but first she had to shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside her captive's clothing. She was to live in his house and mourn her father and mother for a full month. After that month, he could marry her. But if he later decided he didn't want her, he had to let her go free. He couldn't sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. This law, disturbing as it is to modern readers, actually provided significant protection in the context of ancient warfare. Rape was prohibited. The woman was given time to grieve and adjust. If the arrangement didn't work, she was freed, not enslaved or killed. She had rights even as a war captive. Here's a law about lost property. If you see your fellow Israelite's ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to its owner. If they do not live near you, or if you do not know who owns it, take it home with you and keep it until they come looking for it. Then give it back. Do the same if you find their donkey or cloak or anything else they have lost. You had a legal obligation to help, even if it inconvenienced you, even if you didn't like the person. The text specifically says, do the same for anyone who is your brother. You couldn't turn away from someone's need just because they were difficult or you had a history of conflict. And here's the kicker. If you see your enemy's donkey fallen under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it. Your enemy, the person you dislike, who dislikes you. Their animal collapses under its burden, and you're required to stop and help. Not optional. Required. This law tried to interrupt cycles of hatred and revenge. It forced interaction, cooperation, recognition of common humanity, even between enemies. Here's one about honest business. Do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy, one light. Do not have two differing measures in your house, one large, one small. We mentioned this before, but it's worth returning to. Having false scales, dishonest weights, this was equivalent to the worst crimes. The text says the Lord your God detests anyone who does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly. The same word, detests, abhors, finds abominable used for the worst sexual sins, for idolatry, for murder. Why? Because it violated the foundation of community trust. If you couldn't rely on honest weights and measures, trade collapsed. Relationships fractured. Society couldn't function. One more. When there was an unsolved murder, when a body was found in a field between towns and no one knew who killed them, there was a ritual. The elders of the nearest town would take a young cow that had never worked or worn a yoke to a valley with running water. There they would break the cow's neck. The priests would be present, and all the elders would wash their hands over the dead cow and declare, "Our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. Accept this atonement for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, Lord, and do not hold your people guilty of the blood of an innocent person." The unsolved murder created a kind of corporate guilt, a stain on the land itself. The ritual atoned for the community, acknowledging the death, declaring innocence, seeking purification. It recognized that some things can't be solved, some justice can't be achieved through normal means. And yet the death of an innocent person demands acknowledgement, demands that someone take responsibility, even if it's the whole community saying, "We didn't do this, but we're accountable for the fact that it happened in our land." Your breathing is so slow now, so deep. The ancient world, with its strange laws, its specific situations, its attempts to regulate every aspect of life, it feels distant, almost dreamlike. Let yourself sink further. We're transitioning now to the stories, the real accounts of what happened when these laws were challenged or broken. But first, just rest, just breathe. Let the strangeness of these regulations fade into the soft background of approaching sleep. There's a story from the book of Joshua that shows just how seriously the law of devoted things was taken, how one man's secret theft brought disaster on an entire nation, and how the punishment reached far beyond the guilty individual. Let me take you there. Let you see it unfold. The Israelites have just entered Canaan after 40 years of wandering in the desert. The generation that left Egypt has mostly died off. This is their children and their children's children finally stepping into the land promised to their ancestors. The first city they encounter is Jericho. Massive walls, fortified gates, a powerful stronghold. According to the normal rules of warfare, when you conquered a city, you got to keep the plunder. Gold, silver, livestock, clothing, food, the spoils of war. But Jericho was different. Joshua, the leader, gave specific instructions from God. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Everything, gold, silver, articles of bronze and iron goes into the Lord's treasury. Take nothing for yourselves. This was Haram, the complete devotion of something to God, setting it apart as holy, untouchable. It meant total destruction of people and animals, and dedication of precious metals to the sanctuary. The walls fell. You probably know that story. The people marched around the city for 7 days. The priests blew trumpets. The walls collapsed. The Israelites entered and destroyed everything as commanded. But one man didn't obey. One man, whose name was Achan, saw certain items and wanted them. Picture him in the chaos of the conquered city. Smoke in the air, people running, the sound of destruction all around. He enters a house, searches through it, and finds a beautiful Babylonian robe made of expensive fabric, richly colored, the kind of garment that marked wealth and status. He finds 200 shekels of silver, a significant amount of money, and he finds a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. He looks around. No one is watching him in this particular moment. He takes them. He carries them back to his tent. He digs a hole beneath the floor covering, probably just dirt or stones that could be moved. He buries the stolen items there, hiding them from sight. And then he goes about his life, saying nothing, acting as if he'd obeyed the command like everyone else. The Israelites move on to their next target, a small town called Ai. It's nothing compared to Jericho. The spies report that only 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers are needed to take it. It should be easy. Joshua sends 3,000 men. They're routed. The men of Ai chase them from the city gate and kill about 36 of them. The Israelite soldiers flee in terror. The entire nation is gripped with fear. If they can't even take a small town like Ai, how will they conquer the land? Their confidence evaporates. Their hearts melt in fear and become like water. Joshua tears his clothes, a sign of deep distress and mourning. He falls face down before the ark of the Lord and stays there until evening. The elders do the same, throwing dust on their heads in anguish. Joshua cries out to God, "Why did you bring us across the Jordan at all? We should have been content to stay on the other side. What can I say now that Israel has been defeated? The Canaanites will hear about this and surround us and wipe out our name from the earth." And God answers, "Stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen, they have lied, they have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. Someone took the devoted things. Someone broke the harem. And until that sin is dealt with, Israel cannot succeed." God tells Joshua, "In the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord selects shall come forward clan by clan. The clan the Lord selects shall come forward family by family, and the family the Lord selects shall come forward man by man. It's going to be found. The guilty party will be identified. And when they are, whoever is caught with the devoted things shall be destroyed by fire, along with all that belongs to him." The next morning the process begins. Imagine Achan standing among his tribe as the lots are cast or the selection process unfolds. His heart must be pounding. Does he consider confessing? Does he think about the items buried beneath his tent floor? The tribe of Judah is selected. The clans of Judah come forward. The Tzara'at clan is selected. Achan is a Tzara'at. The net is tightening. The families of the Tzara'at clan come forward. Zimri's family is selected. Achan is of Zimri's family. It's coming to him now, inevitable, inescapable. The men of Zimri's family come forward, one by one, and Achan is selected. Joshua looks at him. Everyone is looking at him. The entire nation has assembled for this. They all know that someone's sin has caused their defeat, has put them all at risk, and now they know who. Joshua says, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and honor him. Tell me what you have done. Do not hide it from me." And Achan confesses, "It is true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I have done. When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground inside my tent, with the silver underneath." Joshua sends messengers. They run to Achan's tent, dig beneath the floor, and find everything exactly as he described. They take the items and spread them out before the Lord and all the Israelites. Physical evidence of the theft, the covenant violation, the reason for their defeat. Then comes the terrible part. Joshua and all Israel take Achan. They also take his sons and daughters. They take his cattle, his donkeys, his sheep. They take his tent and everything he owns. They bring all of it to the valley of Achor. The valley name means trouble, because Achan has brought trouble on Israel. Joshua says, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you today." And then all Israel stones him. Not just him. The text says they stoned all of them, Achan and his family. They burned them with fire and covered them with a large pile of stones. Why the family? This is the question that haunts readers. Achan was the thief. His children didn't steal the items. His livestock certainly didn't. Why were they all destroyed? Ancient Israel had a concept of corporate responsibility that's foreign to us. The family was a unit. The household operated as one entity. Some scholars suggest the family members must have known about the stolen items hidden in the tent. How could they not? They were complicit in the secret. Others see it as the complete eradication of Achan's line, ensuring that nothing of the one who violated harem would continue. The devoted things had been meant for destruction. They'd been touched by someone unauthorized. Everything connected to them had to be purged. It's harsh. It feels unjust to modern sensibilities. Children punished for their father's sin? But in the logic of ancient Israel, in the framework of harem and covenant and corporate identity, this was justice. One man's sin had caused 36 deaths in battle. One man's greed had put the entire nation at risk. The response had to be complete, definitive, a clear message that devoted things were untouchable. After they'd stoned them, after they'd burned them, after they'd raised a pile of stones over the remains, the text says, "Then the Lord turned from his fierce anger. The blockage was removed, the sin was purged. And when Israel went up against Ai again, they conquered it easily. The valley of Acre remained, a landmark, a reminder. The pile of stones stayed there, and whenever anyone asked about it, the story would be told. This is where Achan was buried. This is what happened to the man who took the devoted things. Let your eyes close. Feel the weight of that story, the severity of ancient justice, the seriousness with which covenant violation was treated. The stones falling, the smoke rising, the valley that became a permanent memorial to the cost of disobedience. Rest now. Let the story settle. We have more to explore, but first, let the gravity of this account pull you deeper into stillness. This story is short in the biblical text, just a few verses in the book of Numbers, but its implications are staggering. It raises questions about proportionality, about the severity of God's law, about what it meant to keep the Sabbath in ancient Israel. The Israelites are in the wilderness. They've left Egypt, received the law at Sinai, and now they're wandering in the desert for 40 years because of their disobedience. It's a harsh landscape, rocky, dry, hot during the day, and cold at night. Survival requires constant work. Gathering food, maintaining tents, caring for livestock, finding water, collecting fuel for fires. But every seventh day, that work stops, the Sabbath. A complete cessation of labor from sunset on Friday until sunset on Saturday. No cooking. You prepared food the day before. No gathering. You collected double portions of manna on the sixth day. No work of any kind. The Sabbath was fundamental to Israel's identity. It was the sign of the covenant, the reminder that they'd been slaves in Egypt who never got to rest, and now they were free people who rested because their God rested after creation. Keeping Sabbath said, "We are God's people. We trust Him to provide. We don't have to work endlessly to survive." One Sabbath day, while the Israelites are in the wilderness, a man goes out and starts gathering sticks. Just sticks. Fallen branches. Dry wood. The kind of thing you'd need for cooking a meal or warming yourself on a cold night. Maybe he forgot what day it was. Maybe he thought no one would notice. Maybe he'd run out of firewood and panicked. Maybe he deliberately defied the command, thinking it was too restrictive. We don't know his reasoning. The text doesn't tell us his name, his tribe, his thoughts. He's just a man. But people see him. They find him gathering wood on the Sabbath day. And they know everyone knows that this is forbidden. They bring him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly. Not quietly, not privately. This is a public matter. The Sabbath law had been given to everyone. Its violation affects everyone. Now here's what's remarkable. They don't know what to do with him. The Sabbath command was clear. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. And the penalty had been stated. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. But apparently there was uncertainty. What exactly constituted work? Did gathering a few sticks really warrant execution? Was there any room for leniency, for extenuating circumstances? So they keep the man in custody while they wait for a clear decision from God through Moses. Picture this man, sitting under guard, surrounded by the community that's deciding his fate. He can see his own tent, his family. He knows what the law says. He's waiting to hear if there's any mercy, any way out. Moses goes to seek the Lord's direction. The entire community waits. Hours pass. Maybe it extends into the evening, into the next day. The tension builds. And then God speaks to Moses. The man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp. It's not ambiguous. It's not conditional. The verdict is death, and the method is stoning, and the entire community must participate. So they take him outside the camp, to a place beyond the boundary of where they're living, away from the tents and the tabernacle, to unclean ground. The whole assembly is commanded to be there. Not optional. Everyone who can walk must participate in this execution. They need to witness it. They need to understand what Sabbath breaking means, and they need to share in the responsibility for carrying out the judgment. Can you imagine how the man feels as he's led out? The weight of stones being picked up around him? The faces of people he knows, neighbors, friends, maybe relatives holding rocks, preparing to throw them? Does he cry out? Does he protest his innocence or plead for mercy? Does he accept his fate in silence? The text doesn't say. It just tells us. So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the Lord commanded Moses. The first stone hits, then another, and another. The sound of impact, the dust rising, the awful finality of it. And when it's over, when he's dead, his body is left there for a time as a witness, then eventually buried in that place outside the camp. All for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. This story has troubled readers for millennia. It seems so disproportionate, so harsh. Death for collecting firewood? Jewish rabbis in later centuries wrestled with it extensively. Some noted that the text says he was found gathering wood, not that he had already gathered it. The Hebrew verb suggests ongoing, deliberate action, not an accidental collection, but a willful, continued violation. Some pointed out that the entire community had just received the law at Sinai. The Sabbath command was fresh. God had provided manna 6 days a week and double portions on the 6th day specifically, so they wouldn't need to gather on the 7th. Everyone knew. This wasn't ignorance, it was defiance. Others emphasized that this happened in the wilderness period, during the formation of Israel as a nation. The laws were being established. Boundaries were being set. The first violations had to be dealt with definitively, or the entire system would collapse. This execution served as a clear message. The Sabbath is not negotiable. Still others noted the corporate nature of sin in ancient Israel's thinking. One person's violation affected everyone. It put the whole community at risk of God's judgment. The camp couldn't be holy, couldn't be protected, if open defiance of God's law was tolerated within it. But even understanding all that context, the severity remains shocking. A man is dead because he picked up sticks. Here's what the story does. It forces us to understand how seriously ancient Israel was supposed to take the Sabbath. It wasn't a suggestion, not a nice idea about rest. It was a defining mark of the covenant, as important as circumcision, as central to identity as monotheism. Keeping Sabbath was an act of trust. It said, I believe God will provide even if I don't work 7 days a week. I believe there's enough. I believe I can stop. In a subsistence economy, in a harsh wilderness, taking a day off from food gathering and survival work was radical. It required faith. It marked you as different from every other people group around you, who worked constantly, who never stopped, who couldn't afford to stop. The Sabbath was also a gift, a mandated rest that protected people from endless labor, that created rhythms of work and recovery, that carved out time for worship and community, and simply being human rather than just surviving. But it was a gift wrapped in command. You didn't get to choose whether to accept it. You rested whether you thought you could afford to or not. And this man's execution demonstrated that the command was serious, life and death serious. Your comfort, your convenience, your personal assessment of whether you really needed to gather those sticks. None of that mattered against the direct command of God. The story also reveals something about communal justice and responsibility. The whole assembly had to stone him. They couldn't delegate it to professionals, to an executioner class. Everyone participated. Everyone carried the weight of enforcing God's law. This meant no one could claim innocence. No one could say, I didn't kill him. They all did. The guilt was shared. The responsibility was corporate. It also meant that everyone thought very carefully before they broke the Sabbath themselves, because they'd participated in executing someone for Sabbath violation. They'd felt the stones in their hands. They'd seen the consequence. It became viscerally real. After this incident, the text says God told Moses to have the people make tassels on the corners of their garments with blue cord in them. You will have these tassels to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of the Lord, that you may obey them. The tassels were a visual reminder. Every time you saw them, you remembered. God's commands matter. They're not optional. They have consequences. And everyone who saw those tassels probably thought of the man who gathered sticks. The man who died because he forgot or ignored or defied the Sabbath command. Let your breathing slow, in and out, like the rhythm of 6 days and 1, work and rest, activity and Sabbath. The ancient world operated by rules that seem foreign to us. Death for collecting firewood. But beneath the harshness was something profound. The insistence that rest matters, that trust matters, that there are things more important than survival and efficiency and getting ahead. The Sabbath said, stop, be still, remember who you are and who God is. Trust Him with the outcomes. And the man who gathered sticks, he stands in the biblical text as a permanent warning. A reminder that some boundaries are not negotiable, some commands are not flexible, some identities must be preserved at all costs. Let his story fade now into the background. Let yourself sink deeper into rest, the very thing the Sabbath was meant to provide. Ironic, isn't it? A man died for violating rest, and here you are, learning about it while drifting toward sleep. Rest now. Let the weight of the story settle. We have one more account to explore, but first, just breathe. Just be still. Let the ancient Sabbath command echo softly in your mind. Remember and rest. This story is different from the other two. This isn't about punishment or execution. This is about courage, about injustice being challenged, about the law itself being changed, because 5 women dared to speak up. It happened during the wilderness period, toward the end of the 40 years of wandering. The generation that left Egypt was mostly gone. Moses was preparing the people for entry into Canaan, organizing the tribes, conducting a census, preparing to divide the land. And that's where the problem arose. There was a man named Zelophehad, from the tribe of Manasseh, from the clan of Gilead. He died during the wilderness years, not because he'd rebelled with Korah or violated some law. He just died, as people do. The text is careful to note this. He died for his own sin, not as part of some collective punishment. But Zelophehad had a particular situation. He had no sons, only daughters, 5 of them. Their names were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. The text gives us their names, which is significant. In a culture where women were often unnamed in records, where they appeared primarily in relation to fathers or husbands, these 5 are individually identified. Their names matter. Their story matters. Here's the problem they faced. The law said that land inheritance passed from father to son. When a man died, his property went to his male children. If he had no sons, it went to his brothers. If he had no brothers, it went to his father's brothers. The inheritance stayed within the male line. This made sense in a patriarchal system designed to keep tribal land within family clans and tribal allotments. Every tribe was receiving a specific portion of the promised land. That land needed to stay within the tribe to maintain the proper boundaries. But what about Zelophehad? He had daughters but no sons. Under the existing law, his inheritance would pass to his brothers or their sons. His daughters would get nothing, and his name, his family line, would disappear from the records of his clan. It would be as if he'd never existed, at least in terms of property and legacy. The daughters could have accepted this. They could have married men from their tribe who would provide for them. They could have lived as dependents in their uncles' households. That's what was expected. But they didn't accept it. Instead, they did something remarkable. They came to Moses. Not privately, not apologetically, but publicly. They came to the entrance of the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, the most sacred space in the camp, where Moses met with God. And they came when Moses was there, along with Eleazar the priest, the leaders of the community, and the whole assembly. This wasn't a quiet request. This was a public appeal for justice, made in front of everyone who mattered. Picture them. 5 women standing together at the entrance to the tabernacle. Around them the leaders of Israel, all men, all accustomed to making decisions, all operating under laws that had been given by God himself at Sinai. The daughters speak. The text gives us their words directly. Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among Korah's followers who banded together against the Lord, but he died for his own sin and left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives. Notice the structure of their argument. They established their father's legitimacy. He wasn't a rebel. He didn't die under judgment for some communal sin. He was just a regular man who died. Then they present the injustice. His name will disappear. His line will end. His portion of the tribal inheritance will go to more distant relatives, and it will be as if he never existed. And finally, they make their request. Give us property among our father's relatives. Not a huge request, not asking to overthrow the system, just asking to inherit what would have gone to sons if sons had existed, asking for their father's name and legacy to continue through them. It's a logical argument. It's presented respectfully but firmly, and it's made publicly, so the answer, whatever it is, will also be public and binding. Moses doesn't answer immediately. He can't. This is a novel situation. The law is clear about male inheritance, but it hasn't addressed this specific circumstance. What happens when there are daughters but no sons? So Moses does what he does with difficult cases. He brings their case before the Lord, and here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. God responds. But he doesn't just respond to Moses privately. The text says Moses brought the case before the Lord, and God spoke to Moses, giving an answer that would be proclaimed to all Israel. God says, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right." Let that sink in for a moment. 5 women challenged the existing interpretation of inheritance law. They presented their case, and God himself said, "They're right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives and give their father's inheritance to them." And then God goes further. He doesn't just rule on this specific case. He establishes a new law, a precedent for all future situations. Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, give his inheritance to his daughter. If he has no daughter, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan, that he may possess it. This is to have the force of law for the Israelites, as the Lord commanded Moses. The law changed. Daughters could inherit. A new category was established in Israel's legal code, because 5 women had the courage to stand up and say, "This isn't right. Our father's name shouldn't disappear. We should inherit." Can you imagine how they felt, standing there waiting for Moses to return with God's answer, wondering if they'd be rebuked for questioning the established order, wondering if they'd be told to accept their place, to be quiet, to let the men handle matters of property and inheritance, and then hearing, "What you're saying is right." The vindication, the relief, the precedent-setting power of that moment. But the story doesn't end there, because changing the inheritance law created another problem. If daughters could inherit land, and if they married men from other tribes, the land would transfer to their husbands' tribes. Tribal boundaries would blur. The careful allotment of land to each tribe would be disrupted. So the family heads from the clan of Gilead, Zelophehad's own clan, came to Moses with a concern. They presented it respectfully, acknowledging the previous ruling, but raising a legitimate question. What if Zelophehad's daughters marry men from other Israelite tribes? Then their inheritance will be taken from our ancestral inheritance and added to that of the tribe they marry into. And so part of the inheritance allotted to us will be taken away. It was a fair point. The solution that had been just for the daughters created a potential problem for the tribe. So Moses, speaking at the Lord's command, gave an additional ruling. What the tribe of the descendants of Joseph is saying is right. This is what the Lord commands for Zelophehad's daughters. They may marry anyone they please, as long as they marry within their father's tribal clan. No inheritance in Israel is to pass from one tribe to another, for every Israelite shall keep the tribal inheritance of their ancestors, so the daughters could inherit. But they had to marry within their tribe to keep the land within Manasseh's allotment. And the text tells us, so Zelophehad's daughters did as the Lord commanded Moses. Zelophehad's daughters Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah married their cousins on their father's side. They married within the clan of Manasseh. The land stayed in their tribe. Their father's inheritance remained intact, and his name continued in Israel. This story is remarkable for so many reasons. First, it shows that the law wasn't completely static. When a genuine injustice or gap in the law was identified, it could be addressed. God was willing to amend the legal code to cover situations that hadn't been anticipated. Second, it shows that women had legal standing. They could bring cases. They could make arguments. They could appeal directly to Moses and through him to God. They weren't completely voiceless or powerless. Third, it shows the importance of property and inheritance in maintaining tribal identity and family continuity. A man's name and legacy mattered. His daughters carrying on that legacy mattered enough to change the law. Fourth, it demonstrates how law tries to balance competing goods. Justice for the daughters, yes, but also maintaining tribal boundaries and the integrity of land allotments. The final solution honored both values. And fifth, it memorializes these 5 women. Their names appear multiple times in Scripture. Their courage is recorded. Their case is remembered. They became part of Israel's legal history, part of the foundation of how inheritance worked for all subsequent generations. Think about Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They were ordinary women in an ancient patriarchal society. They had every reason to accept the status quo, to quietly live as dependents, to let their father's name fade from the records. But they didn't. They stood up. They made their case. They challenged the system. And they won. And because of them, countless daughters in subsequent generations inherited land, continued their fathers' names, had economic security and legal standing that they wouldn't have had otherwise. The law changed because 5 women said, "This isn't right," and had the courage to say it publicly, in front of everyone who mattered. Let that story rest in your mind as you drift deeper toward sleep. 5 names: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. 5 women who changed the law. 5 voices that spoke up for justice and were heard. Their story is different from Achan's execution for theft, different from the stick-gatherer's death for Sabbath violation. This is a story of law adapting, of justice prevailing, of courage being rewarded. It reminds us that even in the strictest legal systems, there can be room for mercy, for adjustment, for recognizing when the rules don't quite work fairly in every situation. Rest now. Let these 3 stories settle together in your mind: the severity of judgment, the seriousness of covenant, and also the possibility of change, of speaking up, of justice done. We've journeyed together through ancient Israel tonight, through laws that seem strange and severe, through execution and inheritance, through Sabbath and sanctuary, through property and purity. You've heard about stones falling and blood guilt, about clean and unclean, about witnesses and city gates. You've walked through the consequences of taking what was devoted to God. You've stood with a man outside the camp, his crime nothing more than gathering firewood on the wrong day. And you've witnessed 5 women change the course of legal history with their courage. The ancient world was different. Justice looked different. Life looked different. The boundaries between sacred and ordinary, clean and unclean, life and death, they were sharp, clear, sometimes shockingly severe. But beneath all these laws, beneath the harshness and the strangeness, there were principles. Community mattered. Holiness mattered. Justice mattered. The vulnerable widows, orphans, foreigners, even working animals, they mattered too. The laws tried to create a society that reflected God's character, just, holy, compassionate, ordered. They didn't always succeed. They weren't perfect, but they tried. And through it all, there's something almost hypnotic about the specificity of it. Build a railing on your roof. Don't muzzle your ox. Leave the corners of your field. Let the mother bird go. 2 witnesses, always 2. Stone by stone, law by law, building a framework for life. You're so relaxed now. You're breathing slow and steady, your body heavy and still. The ancient laws have washed over you like waves, repetitive and rhythmic, pulling you deeper into rest. Maybe you'll dream tonight of city gates and stone benches, of fields at harvest time, of the sound of the shofar calling the community together. Maybe you'll dream of Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, standing brave and certain at the entrance to the tabernacle. Or maybe you'll just sleep deeply and peacefully, the stories settling into your subconscious like sediment in still water. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight, for letting me guide you through this strange and fascinating world, for staying present or drifting peacefully away as we explored what it meant to live under the law in ancient Israel. I hope you've learned something surprising. I hope you've found the curiosity-driven exploration restful rather than stimulating. I hope the words have carried you exactly where you need to be right now. Relaxed, peaceful, ready for sleep. If you're still listening, bless you. If you drifted off somewhere along the way, that's perfect too. That's exactly what this is for. May your sleep be deep and restorative. May your dreams be gentle. And may you wake refreshed, carrying with you maybe a few strange facts about ancient laws, a few names of brave women, a sense of how different the world once was. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community that loves to learn while drifting toward sleep. Rest well, friend, rest deeply. The ancient world has had its say, and now it's time for silence, for stillness, for the gentle letting go of consciousness into peaceful sleep. Good night.